Hey there everybody, I hope you're doing well and welcome back to 12 Days of Amiga, ranking worst to best. Thank you so much for your comments so far in the series. I've been really enjoying them, whether you agree or disagree or just somewhere in the middle, it's all good. So please do put your point of view down below. But I would encourage you to try and watch all of the video before you jump in with comments, because I may answer some of your questions. But nonetheless, let's just have fun and all the rest of it with the series. So, it may seem like I've contrived this to match up with the 12 Days of Christmas, what with having the 1500 on this list and so forth, but I'm going to extend the contrivance a little bit further today and reveal the Amiga that has been vexing one of my viewers, a certain Mr. Spud, who I've known probably for the best part of over 20 years now in the Amiga scene, I think, one way or another, but not continuously, but there you are. But he's been very much wondering what this other Amiga is. Well, today I'm going to reveal it. So, what is it? Well, it's this. Oh, wrong button. It's this. It's the Amiga 2500. Yeah. Well, if I can include the 1500, I can include this. Richard Potter has been in touch with the show with the following.
Dear Vicky, I have to say I am deeply offended. I am the proud owner of all the Amigas you have listed so far, and I have never been so insulted in my life. It's clear to me that you have never used any of these machines, and if you had, you would know full well how good they are when they are upgraded with a Vampire, 256GB of RAM, 5008 terabytes of storage, and 4K quad monitor set up on each. How dare you point out what they were like stock at the time of release. In fact, my Amiga 500 Plus, which I gutted all of its internals out of and put a Raspberry Pi in with the external Packard Bell keyboard and the Amiga Porter rolling thumber, is sublime and proves you wrong. It simply won't do to point out in 1991 a CD-TV with a copy of The Tower No Name was complete wank. I only trust sources that show the machines directly on the video. Good day to you, you gigantic nincompoop of extraordinary magnitude. Richard.
Okay, right. So what is the Amiga 2500? Well, it's this, and this is another genuine photo. No Photoshop, folks. I don't use Photoshop. It's this, as you can see, genuine photo. It's another Amiga 2000 variant, isn't it? So this is the 2500 that was launched or debuted in late 1988. So why am I including this? Well, for one, I included the 1500, so it goes without saying I'd include this. This was an actually sold model. But this was a case of badge engineering done right, in my opinion. So I wanted to provide the opposite end of the spectrum to the 1500. But also, it allows me to fill in a bit of the history between March of 1987, when the Amiga 2000, which this is based off, was released, and June 1990, when the Amiga 3000 was launched, because it seems to me that there's a bit of a grey area in that spot, in that knowledge of what Commodore was up to in that time. So let me flesh it out. It's been an interesting little bit of research that I've been doing. So very briefly, because we haven't seen the Amiga 2000 yet on this series. The Amiga 2000 that this was based off was launched in March of 1987. It was the clearest successor to the original Amiga model, the 1000, which was launched in July of 1985. It's a big box Amiga, and it provides expansion slots inside called Zorro 2. It also features a CPU slot, so you can potentially upgrade the processor easily, and also it includes a video slot. Now the video slot differs on the very earliest Amiga 2000s to the later B2000CR variant, which is what the vast majority of Amiga 2000s are, and all Amiga 2500s are that variant. So that's our baseline. So the Amiga 2000, apart from those expansion slots, the extra drive bays and all the rest of it is very similar to an Amiga 1000. In fact, the very earliest Amiga 2000s are nothing more than a slightly warmed over Amiga 1000 in many respects. But where the Amiga 2000 really laid the foundation was in those expansion slots, because it allowed Commodore to potentially keep on upgrading this machine without having to do a lot of engineering, and that's exactly what they did with the 2500. At the same time as the 2000 release in March 1987, Apple released the Macintosh 2 line, March 87. Now the Macintosh 2 was a lot more expensive, but it did allow, in its highest end configuration, a colour graphics card with 640 by 480, no flicker, rock steady in 256 colours. Now admittedly, the Amiga still probably had the advantage because it had things like a blitter plus all the extra power of the custom chips, so you can't really compare like for like. But in terms of sheer colour depth on a non-flickering screen, the top-end Macintosh 2 had it beaten into a cocked hat, albeit at great expense. So, the Amiga 2000 was also debuted in the same year that VGA came out, which was the latest IBM PC compatible video standard. Now this provided a 640 by 480 rocksteady, no interlace, high-res screen as well, but only up to 16 colours. But those 16 colours could be defined from an 18-bit palette, so a bit more flexible than you might think. Also included a mode called Mode 13H. This was a 320 by 200 lower resolution mode that allowed up to 256 colours. But key to this was that those pixels were essentially chunky pixels. Now what this means is that 1 byte equals 1 pixel on the screen, and games like Wolfenstein 3D and then Doom would take advantage of this. And that's one of the killer apps that really did for the Amiga in its later years. Now VGA was basically a planar system like the Amiga, using bit planes in its 16 colour modes for example, but that 13H mode was, quite special. Bit weird, but it was special. But anyway, so in 87, the Amiga 2000 was still punching, shall we say. It was punching. But Apple didn't stand still, because the Macintosh 2 also featured a 68020 processor, faster than the 68000 in the Amiga 2000. So, Commodore made good of its plans to make the Amiga 2000 expandable, and in late 1988, November 1988, at Comdex in Las Vegas, they unveiled the Amiga 2500. Now that's a lot later than I thought, because I always took it that this was an early 1988 release. It wasn't, because it wasn't until early 1989 that you could actually buy one of these machines. So what was the 2500 initially? Well, it was a Kickstart 1.3, Amiga OS 1.3 system, OCS of course, original Amiga chipset. But above and beyond the standard 2500, it came with a hard disk controller, at first the A2090A controller with a 40 megabyte hard disk, and an A2620 processor card. Now this included a 14 MHz 68020 processor, a 40 MHz 68881 FPU floating point unit, and a 68851 memory management unit. More on that in a little bit. And it also provided some extra memory, typically 2 megabytes. So it was quite a beefy upgrade. But the weird thing about the 2090A hard disk controller was that you couldn't boot from hard disk. And Amigas seemed to be plagued with this problem, because Kickstart 1.2 had a bug in autoconfig that prevented compatible hard disk controllers that could auto-boot from auto-booting. So this meant you had to boot the system with floppy disk. So I don't understand why in late 1988 Commodore was basically releasing a controller card without auto-boot. Anyway, there it is. But nonetheless, the 2500 at least kept pace with the Macintosh 2 line, because the 2X, whilst a 16 MHz 68020 system, likewise the original Macintosh 2, the Amiga's custom chips obviously provided oomph and functionality where the Macintosh 2 line didn't have it, albeit they could display flicker-free screens with more colours at greater expense, as I say. But this begins to show that Commodore is already beginning to lose a little bit of momentum here, because in early 1989, just as the 2500 was coming out for you to buy, Apple launched the Macintosh 2CX. And this was a 68030 based machine, initially at 16 MHz, so same clock speed as the previous Macintosh 2 line, but it was no 30, so they had pipped Commodore to the post. So this obviously upped the ante a bit further. Now in the meantime, obviously this was more expensive, but then Apple went a step further in September of 1989, launching the Macintosh 2CI, a slightly revamped 2CX, slightly different design, but this had a 25 MHz 68030, so the gap is beginning to widen, isn't it? And all the while the Amiga's custom chipsets are just the same as they were 4 years prior. You can start to see where some of the cracks are appearing. And I think the reason for this is that Commodore's engineering depth was just too shallow. They had some amazing engineers, but too much was resting on just too few shoulders. In this case, Dave Haney. Now he, very famous Commodore engineer behind most of the big box Amiga systems, and he was working on these processor cards, the 2500 series, the A2620 and the A2630, more on that in just a moment. And then he eventually took those designs and started updating it, which led to the Amiga 3000 in June of 1990. But what this research that I've looked through has revealed is that in 1989 at the DevCon, Commodore actually announced the Amiga 3000. I thought this was just some sort of like open secret, but not actually announced by Commodore. But no, there it was, clear as day, printed in Amiga World. The Amiga 3000 was coming, and it was going to have a 68030 on the motherboard at 25 MHz. Huh, interesting, pre-announcing it, but there it was. So about a year before it was launched, the Amiga 3000 was trailed. On top of this, they also announced ECS, and the chips were available for developers to buy at the DevCon. So this means that ECS was available 1 year before it debuted in the Amiga 3000. And as I've explained already, ECS was at best a very mild upgrade to the Amiga chipset, providing one slightly unusable super high-res mode. It's not slightly unusable, it's completely unusable. And the productivity mode, which at least provided a VGA 640 by 480 flicker-free screen, but only up to 4 colours. But we've covered that ground. We already know that ECS was too little, too late. So, but it was there, and it was already being basically made available to developers 1 year before it actually made its commercial debut. Crazy, huh? You know, it was going to be another year before this very mild update was available. But also concurrent to this, Commodore were working on Workbench or Kickstart 1.4. Now 1.4 never actually really properly shipped. It appeared in beta form in the Amiga 3000, but it's basically what became Amiga OS 2. But I'm going to tangentially, very slightly touch on at the end of this video. So, Apple have the 2 CI out with a fast 68030 in it, and the 486 is also basically waiting in the wings on the IBM PC front. So, things are beginning to catch up with the Amiga, aren't they? And so, in late 1989, Commodore unveiled a revamped Amiga 2500 configuration, this time with the A2630 processor card. Now this is the one that introduced the 68030 to the Amiga, 25 MHz, and also had the 68882 FPU. So yeah, all things are good. But that didn't actually go on sale until around about February or March of 1991. That's only 2 or 3 months before, well no, 3 or 4 months, get the math right Vicky, 3 or 4 months before the Amiga 3000 debuted, a lot later than I thought. But hold that thought, because it's not completely redundant, as we're going to find out. So, finally, in early 1990, Commodore, at least somewhat specs-wise, has kept pace with the Macintosh 2 CI But don't forget, the Macintosh 2FX also came out in 1990. But more on that in the Amiga 3000 video. So yeah, I'd say that Commodore just about managed to keep its head above the water, but as we know, by 1990, the original Amiga chipset and ECS was really beginning to show its age, if you ask me, regardless of the CPU in the machine. So that's the 2500 in a nutshell. It's a sped up, hard disk ready Amiga 2000 essentially. I just very briefly want to mention there was another 2500 variant called the 2500UX. And this was a Unix-ready Amiga. They came with hard disks as standard, the updated processor cards as well, both O20 and O30 configurations, and a tape drive. Just provided a reasonably priced Unix workstation, and that MMU, which I talked about, the memory management unit, was obviously used for Unix because the Amiga OS doesn't use memory protection unless you're using Enforcer or Mongrel, but that's another matter. But generally, Amiga OS doesn't have memory protection. So that's where the MMU on these cards came into use. It wasn't a completely redundant thing to put on them. It was all to do with Amiga Unix, Amix, essentially. So the 2500 started to tick a lot of boxes. But where it really came into play was with a fantastic piece of revolutionary, and I don't often use that word because it's usually used in context of hyperbole, the NewTek video toaster. Now, you can watch a podcast that I held with Ant Jarvis, who does the Amiga show on YouTube. He uses an Amiga 2000 series with a video toaster to produce a YouTube show. It's fantastic. But the video toaster, very briefly, is a video switcher that makes use of the Amiga's ability to be timed by video signals, essentially, and it basically overlays fantastic Amiga graphics, as well as other 24-bit graphics created within its environment over the top of video, allows you to switch between video sources and output them out, and an amazing broadcast quality piece of hardware that really heralded the start of the desktop video revolution. And of course, obviously, what would be the best machine to put this in? The 2500. That beefier processor card, the extra memory, the hard disk. It was ideal for it. Made even more so by the Amiga 3000, which couldn't quite fit the video toaster card in. So if you wanted a nice video toaster unit, you needed a 2500. And that's why the 2500 series got a stay of execution, because the 3000 couldn't fit the card in. So NewTek developed turnkey solutions which essentially switch it on, it's the video toaster. You know, you don't really see the Amiga environment. And this is really interesting, and this is where I feel that the 2500 not only justifies being in this series because of the interesting development history behind it, but also because the video toaster was one of the most revolutionary products that has happened to computing in general, I think. And yes, the Amiga is part of that, because desktop video at this price point was not a thing before the video toaster. That is not hyperbole. I mean, there was some sort of video titling done on Macintosh 2s, and so Amiga used the Macintosh 2 line to do video subtitling and so forth for their translations of anime into English and so forth. But the video toaster was doing stuff that, at its price point, no other desktop computer system was doing. That's just the way it was. Now, obviously, things rapidly caught up with the video toaster, but that's another story. So the 2500 earned its place there. And the reason I bring this up is that, as you know, I'm a skateboarder. That's why I've got a broken wrist right now. And the thing that makes this interesting is that anybody who knows skateboarding will know that video is a big part of skate culture. You know, I love watching skate videos. They get me stoked to skate. It's just so rad. It's just literally the best thing. And then I go out and skate and I think I'm just like nothing like what I watch.
Oh, shit. I didn't want to do that. Oh, fuck. What the hell was I doing?
But nonetheless, in the late 1980s, the big skateboarding companies were beginning to fracture. So in the 1980s, skateboarding was dominated by companies like Powell Peralta, Vision, GNS, who else? Santa Cruz. I want to say Veriflex, but I think they were already done for by the early 80s. But anyway, there was another big company that I can't quite call to mind off the top of my head. But these companies began to fracture, particularly when Steve Rocco set up a company called World Industries. And they had many different brands, but they all splintered off to look like these small independents. It was all a bit of a big lie, but the idea was it was skateboarders running skate companies. But, no, H Street was another small upstart, but it wasn't one of the big five. But yeah, companies like H Street, New Deal, and then obviously World Industries with their sub-labels like Blind and so forth, all wanted to put videos out. And when Proud Peralta began to really fracture in 1990-91, the members of the Bones Brigade all went in their own directions generally, apart from Steve Caballero. But one of these skateboarders was a little-known skateboarder called Tony Hawk. Now, Tony Hawk with Per Willander set up Birdhouse Skateboards, and Tony was a bit of an Amiga fan. And if you look in some of those Bones Brigade videos, you can actually see his Amiga systems occasionally pop up in there. They've got no relevance in the videos, they're just there. But he confirmed some while ago that when he first set up Birdhouse, the initial videos like Ravers and Feasters particularly were edited on a video toaster with a couple of SVHS decks. And it's important to note that he says a video toaster, because if you listen to interviews with people from the skate industry creating videos at this time, they didn't have a lot of money, but the video toaster was one of the first truly accessible and generally relatively affordable systems for people to create professional looking videos. And so sometimes when I'm listening to skate industry individuals, they don't say, oh, I used a Commodore Amiga to do video editing. That's how we made, these videos and so forth, like Feasters or whatever kind of thing. They'll say, oh yeah, well, we was mostly using things like the video toaster. Because those turnkey solutions that NewTek sold made it look like a video toaster. You didn't really see the Amiga environment. And what was behind that? The 2500. So in some niche areas, the video toaster was phenomenally important. Like way beyond the oft-cited things like Babylon 5, Sequest DSV and all this kind of stuff. You watch some of those early 90s skate videos, and some of them were made on a video toaster. And that's why the 2500 deserves to be in this video. Not just because of my love of skateboarding, but because it gave at least a solid base for the video toaster to run in. So yeah, I think it's a worthwhile machine for that reason. So yes, the 2500 finally bit the dust when the 4000 came out in late 92. And it did well. So, what's my overall opinion of the 2500? Well, yes, I think it deserves to be in at this place because really the major credit goes to its true underpinnings. The Amiga 2000, particularly the B2000 CR, which I mentioned, but we'll talk about that in its own episode. But would I own one? Absolutely not. It's just way too big. I'm not going to create a video toaster setup. I have no intention of using any Zorro cards that go into these machines. So for me, I'm out. That was meant to be my Duncan Bannatyne impression, by the way, but I have to slightly change my impression since the Race Tribunal. I've paid damages and apologies have been made in various newspapers, and I believe the case is now settled. But that aside, yes, I wouldn't have one of these. They're way too big. Where I'd recommend one of these is that, yeah, it comes with a processor card and a hard disk controller, so you can create a nice video toaster setup if you want to. But arguably, you could do the same with an Amiga 2000 with a slightly more modern day CPU expansion potentially, which could go directly in the 68,000 slot, for example. Some of those Amiga 500 upgrades will fit into this. And also you can buy a modern day IDE controller, IDE to SD card or whatever, which would be a lot less finicky than trying to use the SCSI controllers in these. So yeah, I'd say the jury is out on whether you want to pay megabucks for a 2500. But no, they're good machines. They're good machines, I'll give them that. And yeah, I think this is where we start to see the models really begin to justify themselves as not just a rehashing of something that's come before or something done fairly poorly because of the software, but machines that begin to justify themselves because they do actually see some progression of the Amiga system, and also they supported either hardware or software which furthered the capabilities of the creative that was sat behind it. And that's something that I don't believe that can be truly said of the Amiga 1500, the 500 plus, the 600, the CD32, or the CD-TV. Whilst they pushed envelopes in certain ways, in different ways, you know, they made gaming accessible to people, or you know, they might have been the first to market with CD-ROM or something like that in that capacity. They were mild rehashes of a lot of stuff that came before, with the exception of perhaps the CD-TV, even though a lot of that is Amiga 500 underpinnings. It's not an Amiga 500 motherboard, I'm not saying it's an Amiga 500, but it shares a lot with the Amiga 500. So that's where I think we're going to see this curve change. Now, before you hammer with your comments saying that I've created a newsletter using an Amiga 600 in 1992 or 2022, I know, all these things are possible, but whether you had an Amiga 500 in 1992 and did that, or an Amiga 600 and did it, both could do it. With the 2500, this could do things that you couldn't easily do on an Amiga 600, like where you're going to put a video toaster in an Amiga 600. You know, what about rendering Lightwave on an Amiga 500 Plus in 1991? It's going to be painful. It's going to be painful. So yeah, that's where I'm beginning to hopefully justify some of my choices. It's not me having to go at your Amiga that you've upgraded and loved dearly, or the one that you've had since you was a kid, or, you know, a teenager or whatever. I'm not having a dig at you when I say that the Amiga 500 Plus is number 11. Nothing like that. I'm just trying to get some semblance of order where we can see where the Amiga has some progression and advancement and so forth. And very briefly, I just wanted to mention one thing that I think these machines should have had: an updated Amiga workbench look and feel. Even if it was still using 1.3, Commodore should have hired a couple of graphic artists to work for a few weeks on giving the Amiga OS a much more consistent look and feel. Get the icon shapes all organised, you know, consistent. Get the colour scheme sorted out, because a blue and orange 1.3 system against a Macintosh 2 CI running System 6 or even 7.0, it doesn't look very professional. It really doesn't. You know, it looks like some kid has messed about with the palette. You know, and I know that you can change the colour palette very easily on Amiga OS. I know this. But out of the box, it just looks a bit wacky. Commodore should have made a specific workbench disc for these systems to make it look more professional. Nice consistent icons, a slightly better font that doesn't look like MS-DOS, and a slightly more interesting colour scheme would have gone a long way to make the Amiga OS environment look a bit more professional before they released Release 2, but they didn't. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and I'd love to hear your comments on what you think about the Amiga 2500. Did you agree with what I've got to say? Did you not agree with any of it? Throw it all down there, it's all good. I love reading them all. Anyway, I guess that all remains for me to say is see you soon. Peace!